we'll get started. There was actually a time constraint because Bob had to catch a flight, but that's been cancelled. He's now a faculty member at UVA, visiting. What can I say? It's a thrill to have Bob Grossman here today as part of our Distinguished Biomedical Data Sciences lecture series, which is sponsored by the School of Medicine and the School of Data Sciences. So thank you all for being here. I've known Bob for quite a while now, and from the work that he did prior to my arrival at NIH, where we actually started working on the commons. He already had a commons he developed at NCI, developing essentially what was called the National Cancer Institute Genomic Data Commons, GDC, which is a multi-petabyte data sharing platform of various genomic and assorted clinical data on tumours of over 37,000 patients. He's also developed data commons and data sharing platforms for several other research communities, including the general science community through an open science data cloud, environmental sciences with the OCC NOAA Environmental Data Commons, and the NASA project MATSU, not to mention liquid biopsies. So he's really, I think, the pioneer in this concept of the commons, which of course is so important to what's going on here in iThrive, the CTSA resource. He's the director, first of all, he's the Frederick H. Rawson Professor at the University of Chicago and co-chief of the section on computational biomedicine and biomedical data science in the Department of Medicine. Also, so many directorships, what can I say? He's also a director of the Center for Translational Data Science and the Chief Data Research Informatics Officer for the Biological Data Sciences Division at the University of Chicago. But aside from all that, and the fact he's won numerous rewards, he's actually a very nice guy as well. So without further ado, we're really looking forward to what you have to say. Thanks for coming and visiting with us, Bob. Really appreciate it.
So it's a pleasure to be here. I had just a wonderful day interacting with some of the faculty here. I'm the director of a center for data science, and we focus on translation. Using data science to have some kind of human or societal impact, sort of broadly analogous to translational medicine. And I'm just so impressed by what I've seen around here today. I'm going to talk about data commons and where they're going. And these days, I'm sort of I've spent I never wanted to sort of be in this space, but I want to take data and analyze it and make discoveries. But to do that, you need data. So I took a 10-year detour to build infrastructure so I have data. Every 10 years, you should sort of gently switch what you do. So I'm really focused right now on starting to do data science and deep learning over some of the data out there. And the data is available to everyone. So, if you get bored one night and can't sleep, I would grab some of this data and make a discovery. So what's a data commons? So it really emerged from sort of three forces. One was, as everyone knows, there's a lot of data. So I don't have to this audience explain that. People say things like data is the new oil and AI is the new factory. I don't know if that's true or not, but I do know that if, with all the frameworks out there, if you have data, you can make discoveries. There are challenges. As the amount of data scales, it's harder to, it's harder to analyze it. You need specialized computing. If you're doing deep learning, you need GPUs and TPUs. There's batch effects. There's a lot of issues that make it hard to analyze it. The community's been talking about the opportunities and challenges for a long time. I've been going to workshops about this for a long time. I don't think anything would have changed, but there is sort of a cost and economic constraint on this. When data was a terabyte, you could give every R01 investigator the infrastructure to analyze it. It may not have been efficient, but you could do it. You know, we're building right now the Anvil platform for NHGRI. One of the data sets, GTech, costs about $14,000 to download. If it's used just by 100 and it's used by much more than that, that institute has to pay $1.4 million just for the download. Not talking about the storage and not talking about anything else. So the sort of the economics are driving to some platform, and that's what I want to talk about. And once you have that platform, it's really an interesting way to make discoveries. So they're called data commons. I think of a data commons when you just co-locate the data, the tools you need to analyze it, the infrastructure to compute with it, to create a resource for the research community. And I'm going to talk about that. And there have been a sort of growth of these. You know, this is essentially the merger of cloud computing, whether on-prem or in Amazon, Google, or Azure, or some hybrid combination, to do genomics, to do biomedical data science writ large. So we built our first sort of clouds in 2010 to 2014. Companies, I sort of, to prepare for this talk, I looked at all the list of companies that sort of entered the space of doing cloud computing for biology. There's an interesting list, if you get bored, in BioStars. And if you look at it, not only do they have the list of companies, but about over half of them are crossed out because they're still not around. So it's a tough space out there. DNA Nexus is one of the few companies that's still around. There was NCI made a big bet. Again, I think driven by the economics. Their data set where all the science was TCGA. It's about a petabyte. It costs several $1 million for a university to stand up and operate infrastructure to analyze a petabyte of data. And there just was no other way other than to sort of centralize that. But what they did, I think, was interesting. They created this sort of mixed collaborative competitive infrastructure, and they're reasonable about how long it takes to build these platforms. They gave people 2 to 3 years to build them and a couple years to add users, and that created the Seven Bridges platform, the Broad's Fire Cloud ISB's platform, the GDC. We use that to expand our infrastructure, and it was really a growth for several years. At the same time, importantly, the fair data principles will come back to about making data fair, accessible, interoperable, and reusable came out. And since then, there's been a growth. So I just want to talk about why these are built, how these are built, where these are going, what the challenges are, and how you could think about using them. And I like the way GA4GH talks about this. You know, when we build the platforms, I am very conscious of the trade-off. The trade-off is how do you make the data available so patients can benefit, and how do you keep the data secure and compliant to protect the patient's privacy? And if you lead by, when you build this kind of stuff and when you try to use it, there's the just say no and the just say yes culture. I'm sort of the just say yes culture is the patients need to benefit. So whenever we have data and have security and compliance, we have to think of what are called compensating controls so that we can get the data to researchers so the patients can benefit. The other approach is, if you look at this, there's no perfect world, and if you don't let the data out, you can't make discoveries. And so building these platforms is sort of a balance. And the other way I think of this, and I'll come back to this, especially when I come to the scale, if I had to summarize in one slide what's happened over the last 20 years, is we have data and we want to make discoveries. We use databases to organize data around a project. Data warehouses are used corporately to analyze data for an organization. So many of you have access to a clinical research data warehouse for an organizations. EMR. And I sort of think of commons as how do we begin, and it will take another decade to figure this out, to organize data for a scientific discipline or a community. And so keep that in mind. I'm going to talk about a platform. I want to point out all these other platforms, but I have limited time, and if I think about it, I didn't have time to prepare an exhaustive talk about all the other platforms, so I'm going to talk about the one I know. So forgive me. So the Genomic Data Commons is one we built and launched in 2016. It right now has over 2.5 petabytes of genomic and imaging data. Interestingly, each month, between 2 and 3 petabytes of data are pulled out, either to be used in the cloud or to be analyzed locally. But that's a large-scale infrastructure, 2 to 3 petabytes pulled out each month. It's used by over 100,000 unique researchers each year, and it's based on an open source software stack that you can use to build your own commons. And I'm going to, it was also built over open APIs. So we have interactive ways to look at genomic data, to do all the standard publication quality plots, from Manhattan plots to OncoGrid to all of them. But we do that over an open API. So, anyone can use that open API to look at the data. It's public data, it's a public API. If the data is controlled access, like some of the germline molecular data, we authenticate you. You have to get access through dbGaP, but you can build applications that compete with ours and do exactly what you want. You can launch Jupyter notebooks over this. So it's in one sense, we've brought this data together. We've harmonized it. We've run over 20 to 30 individual pipelines on it at scale. We've curated it, but we put this all over an open API. So we've put data portals, real-time analysis systems to look at genomic and phenotype data. But you can do the same thing. You can use RStudio or Jupyter notebooks. And so this is the beginning of an ecosystem. And the way the large-scale resources built by Broad and Seven Bridges and others work is they go over the same APIs. So this is, for the first time, sort of a wide open system over a set of APIs. And you can make it's sometimes a bit hard to submit data and it's a bit hard to pull it out, but we did that as a favor to the researchers in this room so that you can try to build better systems in the future. So it's out there. We call sometimes, as you'll see, this a Gen 2 system, and some of the talk is about, how would we, this took 2 years to build, and it was not inexpensive, but we have a lot of data. I think we run this at the scale for the release data, the not yet released data, the working data. We have over 15 petabytes of data we have to manage. We run hundreds of millions of core hours, so it's a big system. But there are a lot of what I'm going to talk about is how any project can build one of these that work for themselves. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a platform that's open source, so you could build these. In Chicago, we don't have a lot of imagination in my group, so we were trying to think of what to name this new platform. So we finally came, we were talking about it's the sort of the third generation we've done this, depending upon how you count. So we built these general platforms at the 2008 to 2010 for general science and environmental science. We built a next generation system, the Gen 2, basically for cancer data. And so we asked the question, how can we make it easier for other communities? This was our third time, so we called it Gen 3. And then we gave ourselves 6 months to think of a better name, and we just have to live with the name. So it's an open source platform, and it's I'm going to talk a little bit about it. It's sort of its starting point is a little unusual. We don't start. I mean, there are a couple ways, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this later in the talk. And I apologize. You're probably like me in that you don't care how these things work, you care what you could do about them. This may be the last time I ever talk about these, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how they're built, where they're going, what the challenges and opportunities, but I really get excited about what I can do. All the platforms we have open APIs. You can just put a Jupyter notebook over them, and you can easily analyze the data right away in a secure way. The way these all work is you start with a data model. Now, there are two types of people in the world. There are types of people who, when they're doing analysis of biomedical data, have a data model, and then there are types of people who don't and just have a bunch of files. So we already lost 90% of the world by saying you need a data model. Now, the people with data models are happier. Raise your hand if you have a project and you have a data model and you can explain that data model to someone. Okay, these are the happy people. Raise your hand if you just are going to work, or you don't have to raise your hand. You have files, you really don't understand. Some of the files have columns, some of them have rows, but life is too short for you to do a data model. Do we have anyone who's going to? Okay, all right. So I'll come back to what you do if you don't have a data model. We took the viewpoint that not every group not everyone liked data model, but any real project had one person who was never given enough respect, but they would have one person who was the data wrangler or the bioinformatician, and that one person who was underpaid and not loved enough and not respected enough would actually have a data model, make sure the data model might point to standards, and align and curate the data with that data model. So that person was supposed to then take that data model and put it into JSON, which is easy. If you can do a data model, you can do JSON. And once we had that, our system takes that data model and we build you a commons. And that commons has an API so you could submit data. That commons has an API so you could query it. That commons has a data submission portal. That commons has a data exploration portal. I'll show you some examples. It comes up with security and compliance. And so the first step was you build the data model, then you auto-generate the commons, then you import data. Now, again, to import the data, you have to arrange the data according to the data model. So people said, I really don't want a data model. I just have this random collection of files. Can you put it into a commons? And I'll get back to that, but this assumes you can submit the data, and then you can explore the data. You could create synthetic cohorts. You could put them into Jupyter R. You could put them in other platforms. So we built commons this way. I'm going to show you a picture. Oops, wrong way. So we've built over 12, and we're going to have 15 commons like this. And then I keep score. Well, I'll come back to this, but let me come back to it. So let's say we have 12 to 15 commons. These things can now be done much more easily than we built the Gen 2 genomic data commons, because there we had to sort of build the whole system. Here the system is auto-generated, and as we add new services, for example, to do some kind of large-scale workflow, they come up for free. And so we've built a large number of them, and if you would look at them, they're all kind of interesting. And some of them, like for the how many people have a dog? How many people have genotyped their dog? Okay, it's not expensive to genotype your dog. We build a canine data commons. Send us it's a good model for cancer. Submit your genotyped canine data. And this is a nice common. It's open. It's not controlled access. and it supports the canine population. And you know, if you have a friend who has a birthday and has a dog, genotype their dog and send it to us. I don't mean genotype, do whole genome. If you're going to do it, don't do a genotype, just do whole genome analysis. Okay, so now, where are we? I want to talk a little bit about how do we interoperate these. How do we, let's say you have a project, we were talking at lunch, if you have just the MESA data, how you bring up one of these. Let's say you're studying COPD and you want to bring up one of these. I want to talk a little bit about how you architect this system. And I started off as a computer scientist, and there are not that many good ideas in any field. There are a lot of bad papers, just a few good ideas. One of the good ideas in computer science is called the end-to-end principle. How many have, I know some of you have, raise your hand if you've met the end-to-end principle. Okay, I'm going to, so most of you aren't going to learn anything from my talk. I'm going to tell you one thing. It's called the end-to-end system. So the end-to-end principle. It's the principle that was the design principle for the internet. Now, everyone uses the internet, but I think a lot of you haven't, the internet is kind of complex, it's distributed, and the question you should ask is not why it's so slow. The question you should ask is, why does it work at all? So why is that an important question? That's an important question because most, I mean, you may not be aware of this, but most large, complex software systems don't work. They are very expensive. They never work. They rarely come to production, and it just creates a sort of a minor industry of people who write reports on why large-scale software systems don't work. You don't have to raise your hand, but if you want to volunteer, have any people written reports describing the failures of large-scale distributed software systems? Okay, yeah, I've written a few of these. You don't learn very much because after you do 3 or 4 of them, they all fail for the same reason. So, or a small set of reasons. So the end-to-end principle, so this is really important because if we can build out 2 types of systems for the data science we have to do over distributed biomedical data, the end-to-end principle basically says large systems are going to evolve over time and we don't know how they're going to evolve and they're going to change very radically. So we should single out the smallest number of software services that will allow them to work. So, since you went to high school, you've seen that we keep adding new applications, new types of games. We didn't have video at the beginning. We didn't have streaming music at the beginning. And when we add those applications to the internet, you don't change the routers in your home. You don't change the switches. You don't change the infrastructure in the offices that your internet providers use. You change your browser. You change the apps, but nothing else changes. That's an example because the end-to-end principle is a layered system in which you don't have to change the core software. And so when you build systems like data commons and when you build systems like what we're going to talk to of ecosystems, we can build them as boxes and say, here are the standards, here's how we have to build them. And we could say, we don't know what's going to happen in a 4-year project. It's going to change multiple times, but we want the smallest number of services. That's the end-to-end principle. And that's how we built our first data commons. And when we started, we didn't have Jupyter notebooks. When we started, our studio wasn't things people did. And yet we didn't change anything in anything we did. We just, these things come for free. And so the end-to-end principle at 50,000 feet is what's the smallest number of services so that smart bioinformaticians can put data in and smart researchers could get discoveries out. And so we built this, we gave a name to the services called the Data Commons Framework Services. this is really, and right now we put these over Amazon, Google. We'll soon put them over Microsoft. We can put them hybrid on-prem and in the cloud. And it's a small number of services. It's services, how to authenticate you, figure out what you're allowed to use. Services for importing data objects like genome files, CRAM files, BAM files, images, movies, exporting them, assigning them metadata, and assigning them globally unique IDs. And services I'm going to describe in more detail for clinical data that we're just adding now. And this is the architecture. And then there's a lot of innovation of how to get data in. There's a lot of innovation on how to make discoveries. There's a lot of information to use, how to do knowledge bases, commons, workspaces, but all that, how you do ML, but all that can go for free. And so when we built these 12 or data commons, each of them were sponsored by someone else. They had their own agenda. They gave us our own money. They give us marching orders. They say, don't dream, don't imagine, just build this. I'm not going to give you enough money. I'm not going to give you enough time, but you got to build it. So who wouldn't want to do a project like that? But the way we built this is we built them with the framework services. So now, if a researcher is authorized to get data from 2 or more of these, they can build, anyone can build applications because they're built over these framework services. So you can now build applications that get data from 2 or 3 of these. So if I look at this as an ecosystem, each of which is done differently, each of which with a different data model. So this is different than the first ecosystem, which is a single commons that creates a data model through a common API. If I look at it this way, this now has an aggregate. It actually has, when I did the slide last week, it has over 500,000 separate cases or participants or patients. It will shortly have next week or the week after 600,000. Our goal is to get to 1 million within a year. It has over 45 million files, over 8 petabytes of data, and it's going to grow, I think, quite quickly. I think within a year we'll have over 20 to 25 of these, well over 1 million of the subjects, and when people want to interoperate, they can. That's sort of the broader ecosystem, just because we build them over framework services. And as institutes like NIH and companies like Google create their own authentication authorization, we'll just interoperate with them. There are just so many of them. We're going to interoperate. We're going to federate. We're going to interoperate. So, there's the gen3.org that allows you to sort of build a commons. There's the framework services, and it's not great documentation, but when you graduate from here, come work from us, and if you have good English skills, you could help us. We also created a lot of this is how do you do governance, how do you write the agreements, how do you understand liability, how do you do all those things. So we created in 2008 a not-for-profit so it could work best practices on how to do security, compliance, data governance, commons governance, especially as these things begin to interoperate. That's called the Open Commons Consortium. And so, we talked about data commons. I didn't mention data clouds. Sometimes people distinguish where you compute from where the data is. It's a bit of an artificial distinction. Data clouds came first. It allows you to compute, but it doesn't have the harmonization, doesn't have the data models. It doesn't have a lot of the curation that you would have a cloud. A cloud is just, you have the data, maybe in a lake, and you can compute over it. A commons has one or more data models, harmonized data, a core set of services, governance, data sharing. And I think a lot these days of how do we build ecosystems. How do we interoperate multiple data commons, multiple databases, multiple knowledge bases to create an ecosystem of applications, portals, notebooks, knowledge bases, and simulations across them. Now, I dramatically simplified this. The starting point of this was because when you have a petabyte of genomic data, now it's 3 to 5 petabytes, it's not so easy for you to work with it. So the core way we manage that, when I started this project, it was very difficult to get a long-term archival storage system that would manage a petabyte of data. Whenever we had these, they would keep losing data. This was before basically S3 and Google stuff was around. And so this was a big deal. So basically, we put these genomic files, which can be quite large, and image files into multiple clouds. We assign them a common globally unique ID, and then you pull that back and you pull it from the nearest cloud. That works. It made these systems work, but even though genomic data is big, it's not, BAM files are not complex. The underlying genomics is complex, but the files themselves are really simple. In contrast, the clinical data is really small, but it's extremely complex just as a record and data structure. For those of you who used it, you might have hundreds, thousands, or tens of thousands of attributes. So there's sort of two cultures in this space. There's the top culture I've talked about, where I have 10,000, we started with the TCGA, which had 10,000, now we're up to 83,000, but it has 10,000 cases. We run a pipeline over that. The pipeline might take several months, but in the end, we just have to manage a few petabytes of data, run a pipeline for a few months over a lot, and then we get things that people can make discovery. The bottom scale is this, how do you manage the clinical data? We have different ways of doing that, and then you might put it in a clinical research database, you might put it in I2B2, you might put it in some other structure, and you need to make the discoveries, you need to combine them. So this is an old problem. There's a lot of ways to solve this. We have FHIR, we have OMOP, we have BioCaddy, we have PhenoPackets, we have a lot of other technologies. We ask, so why is this hard? If you have a system like this, or you have a system like this, and you have to manage the clinical data. I'm not talking about the clinical data for an operational EMR, which is a whole nother thing. I'm not talking about using the EMR for revenue management or vendor management or anything. I'm just talking getting the EMR into a place where you can make discoveries. This is how I look at it. You have the life cycle of a project over several years, and then the bioinformaticians and data curators who I love say, I got you a data model. I say, fine, give me the data model. And then they send me the data, and I spend a lot of time putting it in and aligning it with the genotype data, and then they have a meeting with me and say, I got you a better data model. And I want to say, well, why didn't you give me the better data model at the beginning? But I don't say that because I'm one of the people who love these people. And then what happens is the project itself gets another additional modality. When we started, there wasn't ATAC-seq, there wasn't single cell. So some kind of additional data comes in, and then I ask them, give me a new data model so I can support the additional data. And they go, look, I got a day job. I'm not going to give you a new data model. I got to manage my current data model. Eventually, I get a new data model. So there's this sort of life cycle. So there are two types of projects. If the data model doesn't change, my claim is no one's looking at the data and it's not important data. If the data is important, if the project's important, it's used for a long time, the data model changes, you get new data, you get new modalities of the data, and you sort of get this long process, including every few years, the whole system changes. So we have to manage that. And so one of the insights when you're building systems like this is it doesn't much matter one way to look at a system is I don't care what's inside, I care about how to import and export the data. So this is kind of weird, but if you think of it, this is one of these other powerful ideas. If you can understand how to import something into a system and how to export it out, it's a pretty powerful way of looking at it. And so I'm going to split in ecosystems and commons the genomic data and the image data from the bulk clinical data. So if someone gives me a bunch of data, this is a dump of a warehouse or a particular set of data, and I'm going to manage, and they're going to be linked because the bulk clinical data has pointers to the genomic data. And if I need to make the genomic data fair, I know how to do that. I've described it. If I want to manage the pipelines, I know how to do that. We got pipeline languages, we got Dockers, we got all containers. If I want to encapsulate the tools, I got ways to do that. If I want to link data and code, I have ways. But if I want to make clinical data portable for, say, 10 to 50 years across systems, I don't have a great way. I mean, we got all the systems I talked about, but from our viewpoint of managing this at scale, we don't have it. So we internally introduced a format, and we have to do this at scale. I mean, it matters to us whether it takes 10 minutes, 10 hours, or 100 hours, and depending upon how you do this, it scales. So this is a standard problem. It's called serialization. It's a binary format where you take very complex data and you put it into a binary file so you could process it. So we took clinical data, we took the data model, we took the data dictionary, and we require that every element of the data dictionary point to a third-party ontology, and we think of that as a unit, and then we manage it using FAIR principles. And there are two ways to serialize data. They're both very, very, very widely used. One's used in Hadoop called Avro. Google created something called Protocol Buff. They have a sort of a fundamental difference. Clinical data changes all the time, the schema. Protocol Buff doesn't sort of make that. Even though you could update it, you have to track a couple different files, including a schema file. Avro is completely encapsulated with the data model, the data dictionary, the schema, and the data. And so the way I think of this, and again, this is like the end-to-end principle, this is a very, very powerful idea. I have some application, and I'm going to export this portable format for biomedical data and import it, and that's how we do these at scale. In particular, if I have one of our projects, a BD Catalyst, has about 70 projects in it. One of our commons has about 70 projects. Each of those projects might have 3 to 5 different versions of the schema of the clinical data, of the phenotype data. So that's one commons might have 200, 300, 400 of these. And so I'm going to manage them as files. And then because of the way they're done, I can immediately do efficient indexing, cross-searching, and everything else with that. And that's what our next version of Gen 3 is. That's how we build this. So I can sort of pull out a virtual cohort to put into our studio. I can move data between commons. I can update a schema by downloading it, exporting it, running a very efficient process in it, and importing it again. I can index it at scale. Not that these things have been used, but we have to do this at a scale that's 45 million files. We have to do this at a scale that's it's quite a large scale. So if doing this efficiently is all the difference in the world. So I want time for questions. I'm going to again apologize. I find it helpful as I build these things to have principles, because if you try to get people to share data, they say, I'll take your data, and they often don't offer their data. That's just a common observation. The advantage of having principles is you could use the management technique of shame to try to get data from other people to improve science. So why do we want to share data? Data is even though we have a lot of data for the questions and hypotheses we want, we sometimes have an embarrassingly small amount and we don't have enough, and so we have to bring data together. The Bermuda principles fundamentally change how we work with genomic data. What Phil and others did with open access for PLOS and archive.org fundamentally changed publications. You could ask, we really don't have principles for commons or for interoperating them. What would they be? And so I just want to remind you that these were radical principles. Some of you lives were changed by these, but data has to be released. You have to have immediate, but these were the original principles. And you have to make the data entire sequence freely available. Notice this is not how we treat phenotype data. So several years ago, I proposed just 3 principles for if you want to share data with commons or similar infrastructure. One is that if you fund the research that produces the data, you have to fund the research, the researchers should share the data. So one, it's certainly NIH does this, but if you look at the foundations, less than half of the foundations require that when they fund research, data be available to others. 2, if you're going to fund research, fund the infrastructure. Now, foundations have a certain amount of money, so if they fund the research, they have to, and the infrastructure, they have to fund further research. So unless a foundation starts that way, it's very difficult for a foundation or anyone who doesn't start that way to do it. And so the second principle is, you have to sort of make that judgment. You could decide how to do it, you could decide what it means, but you have to make that judgment. And the third is, if you're in this business, you should interoperate. So you'd be, certainly NIH does this. We can argue about how well they do it for certainties, but most foundations don't, and there will be network effects if you do this. That is, the ecosystem you create will be greater. So that's if you're a sponsor. Oops, I'm going in the wrong direction. I'm not going to go through all these, but I have these 15 commons. They could all interoperate, and very few of them want to interoperate. So they don't want to interoperate because half the people, they don't want to interoperate because usually they're a set of complex incentives and disincentives for interoperating. So I have a few principles to sort of expose those incentives and disincentives. One, if 2 platforms interoperate at the same, 2 platforms have roughly the same level of security and compliance, let's say one trusts the other. You have to know who they are, but let's assume they have the same level of security and compliance. So, the first thing says you should interoperate with other trusted platforms. I mean, if they have no security, there's a good reason not to do it. 2, you should follow the golden rule of data resources, that if you take someone's data, you should let them have your data. 3, 3 is a little technical. 4, you should sort of allow competition. You shouldn't say the only way to get to my data is through a particular application. You should have, because we're going to have lots of ways to get the data and make discoveries. And, in the end, patients are going to be able to give us their data. Some data is so sensitive, or some laws are such that you can take other people's data, but you can't get them. But we can federate in that way. We build systems like this. So I'm going to, why do this? Well, it can move the research faster. If we do these things, the research is reproducible. There are lots of papers that, you can say the effects are so weak that you may not trust the paper may not stand up over time. If you create these kinds of systems, you could create what you might think of as evidence commons. I mean, I've been trying to study whether 2.5 particulate matter in countries like the US impacts health. We know it impacts health, but to actually show that at scale over data is quite hard. So instead of publishing a paper where you sort of take a little bit of data, do an analysis, and make an assertion, you could easily create a system, which we're doing, where you let people contribute data, you do a Bayesian computation to adjust the posterior, and then say what is the posterior for all the data we have to date of the hypothesis that for a particular ICD-10 code or something, we have the evidence that would give us a causal a model like that. Call those evidence commons. And then we can interoperate it at scale. It also lowers the cost. So I'm going to end this with a slide that is why I started this 10 years ago. So this is why I got into the business. And I'm about to switch business and to use these to make discoveries. So I think most of you have seen it, but this argument is what started me. In the 17th century, and we had instruments that could see small things and large things. They only had 1 to 2 orders of magnitude of improvement of what you could see with the naked eye, but they created a science. A couple of sciences, from astronomy to some of the early parts of biology. And then when I started, one of my first computers was the Cray, and the Cray was only about 10 to 100 times faster than others, but we got a new science around simulation. And so, this is the question I'm asking. The commons are 1 to 2 to 3 orders of magnitude, more computational power, more data than people have been able to use before. So we only got 3 choices. We could say, well, we have screens now, so we're more distracted, so we can no longer create the new kinds of science that our predecessors did, because we're too distracted. Or you could say our predecessors were just smarter, and we're no longer very smart for whatever reason. Maybe it's the diet, and we're not going to be able to create a new science around data. Or, and I'm an optimist, you could just say, well, things are about the same. A data commons is an instrument. It's no different than the Cray is for simulation science. It's no different than a telescope or a microscope is for their sciences. We got a new instrument. It has 2 to 3 orders of magnitude more resolving power because of the data and the computation. So I take the view, I'm not very smart, but I got a new instrument, and I'm going to create a new science called, a particular data science around a particular a particular discipline. And there's this famous quote by Philipson, who was a Nobel Prize-winning solid-state physicist, and he took the view that at scale certain properties are emergent in a very precise sense. He did material science and statistics, and the hope is at 2 to 3 orders of magnitude with the commons as the instrument, you get emergent properties that aren't there at smaller scale. And so that's the second hope. So with that, this is the most fun I've ever had on a day when my plane was canceled. And I just want to, again, thank my hosts and everyone else.
Questions?
Yeah, in some ways, DD-gap is a door into the commons through its authentication process. And some of us think that is probably one of the weakest things in terms of the hurdle they put up personally is. Do you have other alternatives in mind?
I mean, I'm going to say something obvious. I mean, a lot of people have thought quite hard about dbGaP. I haven't. We interoperate with it. Let me tell you what one or two of the groups have said. People have this idea of a passport or library card where, if you're a researcher and certified as a researcher and the data is fairly low risk, then if a Commons has it, you should have access to it. So we're doing a pilot now where we're GA4GH as a standard for passports. We're going to implement that. So that's one approach. I think the other approach is, dbGaP is protecting the patient privacy and following the consents. So with FHIR and some of these other things that are coming, most Commons in 10 years are going to allow a patient who accesses their data to sort of have a blue button-like functionality that will contribute it. So if I get the data from the subject, from a research study, it's under one regulatory regime. If I get it from the patient, it's subject to very little. And so to the extent that we support FHIR and other ways to get patient-contributed data, it dramatically simplifies the data that will be collected in the future. So we're working on putting both of those infrastructures into the Gen 3 infra stack. But there are other people who've thought much harder about that than I have. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a great talk. I think, I can imagine a couple of kind of simple barriers to entry, though, for a lot of people, and that's you can start analyzing data right away, with file systems, for example. But you have to learn a lot of infrastructure to really tap into this. Various kinds of programming infrastructure. Maybe you can comment on how easy it is to.
Yeah, I think.
But
Yeah.
then in addition,
Yeah.
when you get to the issue of scale,
Yeah.
you have studies that are of very limited size. And you have really serious batch effects. As much as you want to harmonize, those are extremely serious, especially functional genomes, when you can't binarize data. So between the two, I can imagine where there's just a barrier to entry.
100% agree. So a couple comments. I completely agree with you. One, within a year, I hope we have a Commons as a service. So you could go to Amazon and Google, fill out a template and bring up a Commons. Two, and then, most of the people come through a data science program these days will know Jupyter Notebooks in RStudio. So if you have a Commons as a service within RStudio interface, it's better than what we have now and a step forward. So I'm happy with that. The serious issue, one of the first things I learned when I started as a scientist was, one of the people I worked with who was more old was, I had done someone else had done something really stupid, because we had this big computer and we could do stupid things. And he says, well, the bigger the machine, the more stupid you could be. And I think the bigger the data, the more easily it is to be stupid. So batch effects are just 100% agree with you. It's just one of the effects. So I'm very, very conscious. I looked at this geospatial variation of incident diseases very carefully for 2 or 3 years. I am very much of the opinion that, first of all, there's conservation of difficulty. That's a really hard problem, and whatever the infrastructure, whatever the algorithm's not going to change it. The batch effects are so I think you have to be aware, and we have to train our students that the bigger the data, the easier it is to do something really stupid. And I don't think we give them that. And the bigger the data, the more you have to run randomization and other techniques that you really understand, so that when you make an assertion, you believe it. And this is especially the case for weak effects. And I think how we do weak effects over big data, especially, there's a whole art to that, and no one's trained in that unless you've spent your time doing this. So I mean, my defining moment in the TCGA was we built this thing, we did the analysis, and I look at the principal components. This is after it's harmonized, and it just shows me what center contributed the data. And this is as good as the data gets. So you're absolutely right. But it doesn't mean we don't use the instrument. Yeah.
So you alluded to this notion of evidence commons.
Yeah.
Which is a very interesting idea, but it opens up the idea of uncertainty management, which arguably is an order of magnitude part of the data management, because you have to track the provenance of data and the sources and the changes to those kinds of things. And people have argued about this for at least 50 years.
That's right.
How to bring this to bear. But do you have ideas and you build some of that out?
We built some of this, and again, I haven't. He'll probably hear me say this. You know, we were just about to publish this, and Amazon took them, so I have to restart. But I think it's just what we do now, where we have a data set, we do an impossibly complex analysis, we say we expose the data, we say we expose the algorithms, but no one can replicate. I tried to replicate all the papers I had on PM25 against it, and I just got completely different results. As bad as it is, I think having an evidence commons that you agree to run for 10 years, where you'll take the data in, you'll do the best, and you know what's there is this is our result. This is the best thing we know at this time for this particular biological problem. It's, you know, but you have to register the problem. We're not going to change the problem. I think we can do it, and I think it's one of the things that might. It would change how we think of weak effect. So weak effect is not what, when you make an assertion, it's not the publication that matters. It's what do those posterior and you know, the a priori and the posterior, how do they change over time? Either they're going to get wider and you're going to be embarrassed you ever publish something, or they're going to get narrow, narrow, narrow. And if as we get more data, as the posterior gets narrow, 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 you know, I think that says something. It's, you know, again, the fundamental problems about evidence don't go away, but the alternative of just publishing these very difficult to replicate things, you know, especially in some of these areas where the effects are so weak. And when the effects are not weak, they're in other places where you can't get the data because the effects are strong enough, everyone's embarrassed to give out the data, and there's a lot of problems like that.
We're not alone. I mean, what you've described is, you know, what's going on in biomedicine and primarily in the US. I mean, are there areas in other fields and other parts of the world that we should be looking at as exemplars that, you know, towards these kinds of development efforts around? I mean, I'm thinking things like I'm not saying it's a good example, something like European Open Science Grid.
Yeah, an Open Science Cloud. They got an Open Science Cloud too. Yeah, I think, you know, the the Force 10 and FAIR and some, Europe is leading on some of this. You know, we're going to have more and more federated infrastructure for various reasons and less centralized. Europe is leading on that. You know, we're building query gateways into all the Gen 3 commons where we can scatter gather queries, and you know that would allow us to interoperate worldwide. So I don't see any fundamentally new ideas. I think it's a small world, and you know the ideas that anyone has in the infrastructure space get around very, very quickly. But you know the trends of having to go to a more federated because of regulation, because of sensitivity, because of the way consents work and the fact that the patients haven't contributed. I think we are going to move to a bit more federated, which is going to make batch effects and these other things even more complicated. The scale of data in Asia and other places, I think, are going to fundamentally change things. But there are a whole host of complications around that. I think the other thing I think the bigger issue is this fundamental issue is as we get more contributed data, we have very little understanding of the, I mean, this is obvious, it's not my field, I just have to live with this. We have this issue, as you and others says, the data comes in and it's contributed, we don't know a lot about it. And so historically, scale has helped. And so, you know, if you, just to remind everyone, you know, 15 years ago when I started doing this, it was absolutely clear to everyone that the only way to do language translation was with more and more complex algorithms. Well, that's not what happened. What happened is we got data, we got compute, and we took simple algorithms, relatively speaking, and large-scale compute, and we changed the paradigm within 5 years. And there is this notion, and I have a paper one day will come out, you know, you can ask the question, do I want to double the data? Do I want to double the complexity and sophistication of the algorithm? Or, you know, do I, well, it's a more, let me just start with, leave with those two. In general, if you look at most problems over time, doubling the data solves the problem. So I sort of have this view that at small scale, it's almost impossible to understand the differences of contributed data. But at a large enough scale, we don't have to average, but you know, we'll get the ability to solve it. That's what happened in a lot of these fields. Just doubling the data is better than, you know, of course you could double your understanding, but it's hard to double your understanding fundamentally of a problem. A new algorithm, new understanding outbeats the data and the compute, but it's harder to predict. So doubling the data, I actually think is going to make some of these other problems a little easier. Doubling the data every 2 years.
Doubling the data is how we got such school of data science.
Yes.
Other questions? All right, in that case, thanks a lot.
One quick question. Yeah.
I was curious as you move to the the ecosystem of data commons, if you were thinking of different ways to standardize ways that different data commons could make assertions about how their data connects.
Yeah, so we're doing that. We're starting to use Open Policy Agent. The principles are designed to put around that. That's the active. There's something called there's an interoperability effort around that. I wrote a blog piece a little while ago in Medium about that. That's a very, very active area.
Okay, thanks a lot, Bob.